Just a reminder to turn your phones to silent mode. Please do so. Okay, we have come to the final talk for today, and it is my great honor to invite Assistant Professors Jessica, Miles, and Els from the History program, and they will be discussing with us the topic on gender, ideas, science, and environment. Histories you may have not learned in school, but actually should. Okay, Professor Els will start first. Ready?
Okay, good afternoon everybody. It's great to see so many of you on this sunny Saturday afternoon. So my name is Els, and I'm going to talk about ideas and history. Now you might think, why ideas and history? What do ideas have to do with history? Maybe you think that history is this. Key dates, I'm sure you're all familiar with this key date, and this person on the right, a certain Sir Stamford Raffles. Maybe some of you might think that history is rather this. Archives and documents, maybe stored in dusty old rooms. Or some of you might think of this, ancient civilizations, and traces of those, like you see these pyramids on the right in Egypt, or heroic battles. But what if I tell you that this is also history? At first you might think, why is this history? Well, today we may think it's perfectly natural that people love their countries. But the world was not always made up of nation-states, as we call it. This is actually a quite recent phenomenon. So there are historians who actually ask questions such as, why did people start loving the nation, and when did they do so? So this is something called the history of nationalism. And this is part of like a broader field called the history of ideas, or intellectual history. So what is the history of ideas? The history of ideas is actually a broad and interdisciplinary field, and it includes the history of philosophy, science, religious or political ideas, and basically we can say that it relates to everything that stems from the human intellect, which is why it's also called intellectual history. So let me go back to the history of nationalism. So I mentioned that the world was not always made up of nation states, right? So on the left, I've included an artwork, it's called Flags of the World, to sort of visualize how today individuals are linked to nation states in the form of all kinds of symbols, such as flags, as you see here. Now these scholars of nationalism, they have sort of debated like when we can see the first appearance of what we call the nation state and the system of nation states that we have today. So some people argue that it goes back to the 17th century, so it's very recent. In the 17th century, you see these gentlemen on the photo. There was in Europe, we had a whole series of wars, and this was a set of treaties called the Peace of Westphalia, which basically ended all these wars. But more importantly, for the first time, people said, wait a minute, we have a territory, and you don't have the right to interfere and to come to our territory, and you don't have the right to interfere in our affairs. So that was first expressed during this time. Now, another question is, when did this first appear, this idea that people love their nation? And again, we have a lot of discussions. So there's a group of scholars who think that it's a modern thing. So they think because of certain things that happened during the modern period, people only started loving the nation during this time. So imagine that you live in 15th century Europe, right? So there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, and all you know is basically what happens in your local little community. So you don't have a sense of what happens outside of this community, right? Now imagine during this time somebody inventing a printing press. So in the middle you see Johannes Gutenberg. So he invented the printing press, and what happened was that now people could circulate ideas on a much bigger scale. So here you see this is an early version of this printing press, and not much later we also have the first appearance of the newspaper. So here an example, the London Gazette, 17th century. So imagine these people reading newspapers, so all of a sudden they get an idea of things that happen outside of their small little community. So that's why people say, this is when they first started to imagine themselves as belonging to a nation. Now, there is another way we can look at the relation between history and the nation. It's also about how history is being used to construct narratives of the nation state and what the nation state is. And this is not very strange given the history of history, because history first became a discipline in the 19th century. So it became taught at universities, and during this time, it was actually sort of used in the service of the nation state. So to tell all kinds of stories about the nation state, and history was presented in a certain way. So this figure that you see here, this is like a small man in a big coat, but he was very important for the development of history as a discipline. His name is Leopold von Ranke. So in Germany, he played an important role in this whole process. Now, so imagine the relation between history and the nation state and how it's being used. Let us now move to a different context and look at some examples. So let's move to contemporary China. So here we have Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Tiananmen Square is actually one of the largest squares in the world. It's 440,000 square meters, so incredibly big. So this is sort of like the area of the square. So I've included a map on the right to give you an idea of what we see on this square. So here basically we see a gate. So that's this gate here. This is the monument to the people's heroes. That's here. Then, very importantly, Chairman Mao Memorial Hall. That's like in the middle of the square. And then in the back, this whole thing, this is the Imperial Palace, the Forbidden City. So this is where the palace used to be during the Ming and Qing dynasty. So it's also a huge area. And very interestingly, here on the right of the square, we have the National Museum of History. Now, the fact that this museum is located so central, actually right opposite the Chinese parliament, also illustrates that history in China is not a trivial matter. So, what is this museum? So, the National Museum of China, it was actually founded in 2002, but it was the merger of two previous museums. And one of these museums was the Museum of the Revolutionary History, and another was the Museum of Chinese History. And so it's said to be the world's largest museum. It's an incredibly big space, nearly 200,000 square meters of display, and more than 1 million items in the collection. So what do we see inside this museum? Yeah, I'm sorry for the bad quality of the images. So on the left, we see traces of a glorious revolutionary past, important people that have contributed to the Chinese Revolution. And in the back, sorry it's so vague, this is actually Mao Zedong in 1949, and he's like proclaiming, so this is the founding of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in 1949. So this is inside the museum. So what we see partly inside this museum is basically based on the recent history of China, right? We have socialism and the Chinese Communist Party, and basically what they believed in was progress, science, and they paid a lot of importance to the masses, so the peasants and the workers, and during this time, they thought that scholars were actually not good people because everybody should be equal, and they were mostly the elite, right? At the same time, they also thought that tradition was rather a backward thing, so we didn't need tradition. So they were criticizing Chinese tradition, including Confucianism. So this is what happened during this time, and this we see in the museum. Today, Mao Zedong is still actually watching over the square. So this portrait is actually located at the entrance of this, when you go to the Forbidden City, you see this portrait. So Mao Zedong is still there today. But what happens in 2011? We see something very strange happening on the square. We see this. So in 2011, in January, all of a sudden, this gigantic statue of Confucius appeared right next to the museum. The statue is 9.5 meters tall. As you can see, the people are very small in comparison to the statue, and it weighs 17 tons. So a huge statue. So it was a little symbolical because Confucius was actually looking at Mao on the other side of the square, right? So, less than 4 months later, we see this. The statue had suddenly disappeared. So we see here, there's a lady trying to get a glimpse of what has happened, and there's a security guard trying to intervene. Now, why has this statue been erected and disappeared? Isn't that a little bit strange? So in order to understand why, we have to look at the more recent history of China. So in 1978, we have the so-called Reform and Opening Up period. So we have Deng Xiaoping, a small man with big dreams, who's sort of the architect of of this period. And we have now socialism with Chinese characteristics. And what this means is that market mechanisms are introduced in China. So what this meant is that all of a sudden people said, well, Chinese tradition is not too bad. So Confucius was okay again. However, at the same time, the revolution was still the basis of the CCP. So that's why people were a little bit confused about which sort of history to promote, right? So this is why we see Confucius appearing and disappearing. Then there's another interesting thing happening. So in the same museum, also in 2011, in the summer they had an exhibition of Louis Vuitton. So in the National Museum of China, we see a collection of these fancy Louis Vuitton bags, and some people said, well, this is actually a bridge too far. I mean, why does the market have to be inside the museum? So we see that apart from these political things going on, we also have the market interfering with history. So today we have history and the market. So what we have is, in China, we have popular historical TV dramas, and they're often praising Confucian scholars, and they were previously criticized. So this is a big change. But at the same time, some people still sort of praise Mao, and we have a sort of Mao nostalgia going on. And during the early 1990s, for example, there was what they call the Mao fever going on. And when you took a taxi, you could see all the taxi drivers having amulets of Mao because they believed that this protected them against accidents. So here are some examples of what we see. So on the left, this is an example of one of his TV dramas. So this was aired in 2003 on national television. So this tells the story of the late 19th and early 20th century. And again, we see like a lot of these Confucian scholars being like portrayed in a positive way, whereas before they had been criticized. So this series was like highly censored, which is why a lot of discussions occurred. So people said, well, to what extent can people reinterpret history for this kind of series? On the right, you see some examples of this Mao fever. You can buy all kinds of Mao paraphernalia. For example, this one. So ironically, Mao, who was against the market, was now being consumed. So you have this famous, this is a lighter, and when you open it, there's a song called The East is Red. It's from the Revolutionary Times. So, you're laughing, that's very good. As you can see from all this, history is not just some dusty documents in old rooms. It's something that's very much being discussed, right? It's used for different purposes, and it has many different layers. And what the past is always contested, because it relates to questions of legitimacy and identity. So I hope to have demonstrated that to you. And I have a quote here that shows that summarizes nicely some of the things that I want to say. Historians are dangerous people. They are capable of upsetting everything. So in brief, I think history and the nation are very closely connected. So I hope to have convinced you that next time you see this, you'll realize that what you're partly seeing is also this. Okay, thank you, and I'll now give the word to my colleague, Jessica.
good afternoon. My name is Jessica. I'm a historian of gender. So oftentimes when people think of the history of gender, they think that the history of gender will be the history of women, or women's history. And that is part of what the history of gender is. But the history of gender is also the history of men and masculinity. So men also have gender. And masculinity is also something that, as a historian of gender, I'm very much interested in. And that's because what is considered masculine in any given society changes over time, and it really depends on context. So when we study the history of masculinity, we can see how the ideas that we have about gender today and about what makes men masculine, what really makes a real man, or what makes women feminine, is actually very dependent on the specific historical and social context that we're talking about. So what we think is the way that men just are, or the way that women just are, actually depends on our historical context. And people in different places and in different times have thought about gender in very different ways to how we might today. So I teach a course at NTU that's called Gender in History, that is about, short for it, the history of gender. And in our first week of class, we did an activity where I gave my students a sheet of paper and they had to draw 3 circles. And in the inner circle, they had to put what they considered to be the most masculine traits that a man could have, or what they considered Singaporean society might consider the most masculine traits. And there were 3 things that came up across all the different groups that did this. So the first was professional success. A man who was successful in his job, who earned a lot of money, was probably quite wealthy, was considered really, really manly. Okay? The second thing, which is related, was power. So that person would have power both in sort of the sense of social power as well as economic power as well. And the third thing was that they would be really buff. They would have a really athletic body. Okay? They would be incredibly fit. So 2 images, we had magazines and they were picking out what they thought the image of the ideal man was, at least in Singapore today. And this is what they chose. So this is the outside, and this is on the inside. So here you have your professional man. Here he's not at work. It's after work, but you can see they're wearing suits, and they have quite a bit of wealth. They have very sort of good lifestyle, but also probably hardworking, which is of course how they get that lifestyle. And then on the right, they're incredibly buff. They have an athletic body shape. So this is the real man, at least for my group of late teens and early 20s students. This is what a real man looks like. In fact, there's a historical explanation to why today this is considered incredibly masculine. Okay, so what history can tell us is why we have the sort of assumptions or ideas about gender that we do have today. And by looking at history, we can see that actually there are other possibilities. There are other ways of thinking about both masculinity and femininity. Okay? So my historical explanation for why today this is considered the masculine sort of ideal, and particularly why professional success is considered so intertwined with what is powerful norms of masculinity, is the breadwinner ideal. So the breadwinner ideal is often thought of as a traditional sort of model of masculinity. In media, the breadwinner is often referred to as sort of the traditional way that society has organised gender relations. So the breadwinner ideal is premised on a man who will go out into the world, he will work and he will earn money, and he will bring that back to his home. And his home is usually in this sort of breadwinner ideal, considered to be sort of the feminine space, so he'll bring back money to his wife and to his family. So often associated with the sort of, honey, I'm home, and this ideal, so, honey, I'm home, what's for dinner? This is sort of the breadwinner ideal that's often considered to be a traditional model of masculinity. Now, in fact, while we might consider this traditional, it actually has a very relatively recent history. So breadwinner as a term was actually coined around the 1810s or 1820s in the United States. And it was an ideal that was particularly tied to changes in society and also in the economy that happened in a lot of nations in the 19th century. And the particular change that it was associated with was the emergence of a middle class. So in a lot of societies in the world, in Europe and also in Asia, prior to the 19th century, the dominant social groups were aristocracies or nobilities. And on the whole, aristocracies tended to define masculinity in terms of cultural refinement and in terms of leisure. So these are two examples. This is on the right we have a 16th century representation of the ideal English gentleman. And on the left we have an image of the Mughal court in North India, and this is a representation of the second Mughal emperor, Humayun, and you can see that he is entertaining dancers, so we have this ideal about a real man being culturally refined, but also usually there would be an association between a noble masculinity and leisure time, because you don't have to work. And that's what defines an aristocracy, is that you inherit a wealthful position, and therefore, while you may work, it's not necessarily something that you need to do. So, in a lot of the world, a sort of noble masculinity was dominant in the medieval and early modern periods. And of course, ideals of masculinity depended on the particular context, but we can say that prior to the emergence of the middle class, this was quite common. Of course, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, a thing called the Industrial Revolution happened. And this is one of the sort of big sweeping changes of the modern period that historians of gender have shown really impacted upon the ideas about gender that people had in different parts of the world. One of the trends that happened with the Industrial Revolution is that the people who had power within society, the social groups who had power within society, were increasingly the middle class. So people who were engaged in business, or people who were in the professions, so lawyers, doctors, architects, people who were trained and had expertise, and that was the basis of their employment. So you had businessmen and professionals being powerful people in society from the middle class. And that changed very much the ideals of masculinity that we had, because now you've got increasingly people with social and political power within different nations working for a living. Okay? So in this context, new ideas about masculinity emerged, and they were increasingly associated with this breadwinner ideal of a man whose masculinity was really proven in the workplace. Okay? It was proven in the work he did to earn the money that he would bring back home to provide for his family. So you get to have sort of representations of manliness like this in Europe. So the suit becomes the new sort of standard of professional, middle class, masculine dress, which was quite a big change. It was a very much more practical way of dressing than had been previously the case. And of course, there were also middle classes that emerged outside of Europe. So this is two very famous figures who you may not recognise, because in these pictures they were quite different to how they would look later. So So here, oh, I do have a little thing of music. I'm clearly not as, oh no. This one, okay. So here and here, does anybody know who this person is? Yeah, we have an answer down here. Yeah, it's Gandhi. So this is before his period of passive resistance, or before he started wearing Indian modes of dress. He was an attorney. He was a middle-class professional man, and he very much fulfilled the ideal of a professional man in India at that time. So he became quite a prominent attorney in South Africa. And here we have the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, who was also quite famous lawyer in his time, but would later go on to popularise what became known as the Nehru suit. But in any case, these two figures very much embodied this middle-class masculine ideal, which was based on professional success. So we have an association between professional success and masculinity in much of the world in the 19th century. And along with this comes the idea of separate spheres. So separate spheres is the idea that the public sphere is where work happens, it's the sphere of the economy, of politics, of public debate, and the private sphere is the sphere of the home. And increasingly people started to separate out home from all those other things, from work, from politics, etc. So you have this separation of work and home. And this was a very new thing. For most people who had to work, they would do so in the home. Or at least there wasn't a very clear distinction between work and the home. But in a lot of parts of the world in the 19th century, you have an idealization of the home as separate from work. And of course, that's pretty central to this idea of a breadwinner. As you go out, you earn money, you bring it back to your family. So the middle class, emergence of the middle class in the 19th century, in the context of the Industrial Revolution, resulted in new ideas about masculinity. And they increasingly associated masculinity with professional success. But as a part of this, you also had new ideas about the body that emerged. So in societies where there was an aristocracy that was dominant, because they were defined oftentimes, and this was particularly the case in Europe, but also elsewhere, by the fact that they didn't work because they didn't have to. That really buff, athletic sort of physique was considered working class, or was considered associated with people who had to physically labour. So it was not the ideal of masculinity to look incredibly muscly. But by the late 19th century, middle-class men had started to try to build muscles in ways that formerly had been associated with labourers and working-class people. And so you have also new ideas about what a real man looks like. So on the right, we have one of the first bodybuilders in Germany in the late 19th century. And on the left, we have an image from an early 20th century Japanese military handbook. And this is an illustration of what the ideal Japanese soldier would look like. So we can also see that with these new middle-class masculinities and the sort of new ideals about masculinity that occurred when the aristocracy in a lot of places were competing with the middle class as to who was the dominant group within society. We also see new ideas about what a real man should look like. So this is all tied up in the emergence of the middle class in the 19th century in much of the world. So these ideas about the breadwinner and an association between masculinity and professional success, which my students thought was, so central to how a man is defined, at least within Singaporean society, is also incredibly powerful in a lot of the world today. So this idea that of the breadwinner, of a man who goes out and into the world, makes money, has professional masculinity and professional success is still very much apparent. So Obama, part of his campaign for the presidency was that he was a self-made man, that he has this sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and through your hard work, sort of achieving success of various kinds, including the professional. So these ideas about masculinity that came about in the 19th century are still very powerful today. But the idea that I want to take home from all of this is that masculinity and femininity and how we think about both the gender roles of men and women and what makes men and women who they are very much depends on the historical and social context. Okay? So masculinity is something that changes over time. It's not something that is innate to who men just naturally are. It's a social construct. Okay? It's something that is the social interpretation of what makes men men. And that changes depending on context. So I put up this image because the art of manliness is a lovely illustration of how manliness is not something that is static or stable or unchanging over different historical periods, and that in fact it is something that is constructed in particular historical contexts. It's something that, in a sense, people learn. And today, if you feel like you're struggling to be manly, there are a whole range of apps that will tell you how to be manly. But the point is that if this app was made 20 years ago,